So, so that's the sort of nuts and bolts. I asked this question a while ago. So what's the hardest aspect of responsive design? Is it responsive images? Is it advertising? Is it sort of these things, or is it updating your process and workflow and sort of, dealing with people, and just, overwhelmingly people. Yeah, it's a people thing, right? Mark Bolton has this great quote. He says that the design process is weird and complicated because it involves people who are weird and complicated. I'm like, that's pretty accurate. So I had the opportunity to work with a few really wonderful people. Josh Clark, who's sort of spearheaded these projects. He sort of pulls together these sort of ad hoc teams to come together for a short period of time to do work. So I had the opportunity to work with Dan Ball, who's a fantastic visual designer, Jennifer Brook, who used to run all the mobile efforts at the New York Times. She was like on stage with Steve Jobs when they introduced the iPad, so it was like amazing to work with her, and Jonathan Stark doing a bunch of JavaScript stuff. And so we had the opportunity to work on a couple projects together for Entertainment Weekly, TechCrunch, and then also sort of some of the other projects that involves sort of various players, the Time Inc. project and things like that. So the big thing that we had to do is really reset expectations, right? Does this look familiar? Let's review the new web design. Gather around the table. Bill will go to the printer and print out a copy for everybody, pass it around the table, right? So people could draw on the margins and tell you you're wrong, right? This is not good. This is not how websites are consumed, right, and interacted with. Dan, who I had the opportunity to work on, he said, as an industry, we sell websites like paintings. Instead, we should be selling beautiful and easy access to content, agnostic of device, screen size, or context. And I can't tell you how much I agree with that. And that's a huge thing to sort of, have to come to terms with that and help your clients come to terms with, and really help set their expectations that, things just ain't the same, so we can't keep doing things the way we've always done. And that also means resetting how we work together, right? This idea of the waterfall process, right? This guy's wearing business casual to dressed up for the occasion. But this idea of, again, creating that 300-page wireframe PDF, right? And that goes through a series of approvals. And then going into, they hand that off to a visual designer who colors in the lines and makes it look good, right? And then after 17 rounds, right, resulting in homepage _V17 final V2 edits V2 final for review .psd, right? And the budget's been blown over twice and all of this stuff. Eventually, those designers go over to the development cave door and slip them quietly under that and say, get this done in 2 weeks, bye. We're already late, right? It just doesn't cut it, right? This is sort of disrespectful. I think that one of the biggest concepts I think I could tell you about is that notion that front-end development is very much design, needs to be treated as part of the design process. And it's not, and I will respectfully disagree with you, it's not that every designer needs to know how to code. It just is about really treating that aspect of the development process, this front end, this HTML, this CSS, this very presentational layer, as an essential core part of the design process. This has been like the story of my career has been like an identity crisis, right? And I said, well, what do you do? Right, HTML and CSS. Oh, okay, you're a coder. Go sit over with the Ruby guys, right? Whip us up some gems. I'm like, normalize some databases for us. Write this middleware. I'm like, my mom's an art teacher. I've never had a computer science class in my life. It's not what I do. But because you code, right? You're automatically bucketed in as a developer, and that's a crying shame. So I do think it's absolutely important to treat front-end development as an essential part of the design process. And again, that might sometimes be the same person, right? That designer and developer might be the same person, or it could just be people working together, right? Working more closely together, sitting next to each other, communicating more. And this is a bit of a lie, because it's not like throughout the entire process, everyone's guns blazing all the time. And for us, it looked a little more something like this, where it's like, yes, of course, at the very beginning, Jennifer is doing our sort of, content strategy and information architecture is firing on all cylinders and making a lot of work. But that doesn't mean that Dan and I, right, doing the visual design and front-end development, respectively, can't get started on things ourselves. So those are the expectations, and those are the things that we've communicated to our clients and got them to buy in on. So once we do that, once we reset our clients' expectations, then we go into gather mode. And gathering mode, in addition to, doing a traditional content strategy, all of that stuff, you could do things like using a tool like Stylify Me, which you slap in your URL to that thing, click the button, and it spits back to you all the swatches you use in your designs, all your different font styles and things like that. Like, this is awesome, right? To talk about jump-starting a style guide, right? In addition to that, I think that conducting an interface inventory is absolutely essential. So what an interface inventory is, if you're familiar with a content inventory, there's like giant, Excel spreadsheet that just has every single URL on the site. It's like really a lot of hard work, but at the same time, very, very necessary step in the process. What an interface inventory is essentially just like a day of screenshotting. So this is my bank, who I hate. With a burning passion, and you could sort of see why, right? This is just actually a few pages from their site, and look at all these distinctive button styles. Like, that is nuts, right? Get into it, learn more, and 17 different shades of orange and button sizes and things. All the arrows are all over the place and drop shadows. This is awful, right? If you could sort of go through and start categorizing these things. All right, put all the buttons in one bucket, right? Put all of your text inputs in one bucket. Put all of your accordions in one bucket and things like that. And what this does is this gives you a really great idea of how consistent or inconsistent your interface is. So this is Etsy, which runs a really tight style guide-driven shop. And you could see how much more deliberate their button styles are, right? Very, very good. But even them, right? You could go through, and these are all content sliders or carousels or whatever you want to call them. But the opportunity here is in conducting this interface inventory, you're able to basically say, okay, how long is this going to take to convert to a responsive environment, right? Are there redundancies here? Can we consolidate some of these patterns and maybe sort of make better use of all of that, right? So that's what an interface inventory does, is you're documenting your interface, you're looking for inconsistencies, you're sort of gathering everything up, and all the while you're sort of, establishing this shared vocabulary and laying the groundwork for your future style guide or pattern library. And in addition to that, you're really helping set the scope of the work, right? How long is this going to take? Right, and by sort of laying out every widget on the table, what you're doing is you're sort of not being surprised that later on. So that's gather mode. So once we do that, then we go into sort of this our first design phase, which is quite broad. I love showing this. A friend of mine is a preschool teacher back in the U.S. in Washington, D.C., and she had a student ask, "How do you make a website?" And she goes, "Well, actually, as it turns out, I know a guy who, a friend of mine is makes websites for a living. So they gave me a FaceTime call, and this 4-year-old girl, Ava, asked me, how do you make a website? I said, well, it's a good idea to sketch or draw a picture of what you want that website to be. It's a good first step. So a couple hours later, I get the picture message back. This 4-year-old girl is better than 90% of the designers I've ever worked with. Like clear hierarchy, clear titles, color coding, clear, again, like focus area, active states, like she's 4 years old. This is the home page. Again, more active states, clear hierarchy. Her buttons are more consistent than my banks, right? It's like ridiculous. I love showing this, though, because, obviously these aren't, highly polished wireframes or comps or anything, but very clearly, you know exactly what's going on this web page, right, and in what general order. And I think that really embracing that sort of messy sketching process, right? You showed your whiteboards and things like that. Absolutely. Jason Santamaria has a great line. Ideas are meant to be ugly, right? It's just about getting them out of your head and onto paper, getting approval on those ideas. It's not about sort of going away for weeks and trying to craft it, and that's just a waste of time. So for TechCrunch, this was Jennifer's work. She sketched in Keynote. Was her sort of design weapon of choice. And basically, she established these patterns, right? Here's this featured island and river list, river grid island. And she's basically just saying, listen, we're going to be using these sort of general patterns throughout the interface. But you could just see how abstract they are, right? And that's all they need to be at the early stage. And from a coding standpoint, I'm able to get to work, right, sort of sketching things out, right, writing those atoms and molecules, right? We know we're going to have form fields, so I might as well start now, right? We know we're going to have a site search. We know that we're using a third-party commenting platform, right? So I could sort of start prepping all of those materials. And while it's not technically sketching, I'm trying to write things as good as possible, it's still, I'm planning on coming back and revisiting these things over time, over and over again. Right? We knew that these things were going to be publications, so text elements like block quotes and pull quotes would be very important. These things were ad supported, right? So including those ads in our interface right out of the gate helped us sort of design around them. There's sort of an unfortunate reality that we just sort of had to deal with. So that's my sketching, right, that I'm able to get started with right away. And Dan was able to start by crafting style tiles. For those that aren't familiar, style tiles are sort of like a step above a mood board, but still not quite a comp, right? It sort of hints at what type of vibe you're going for, right? Here's what colors we're thinking of. Here's some examples of what text we're thinking of utilizing. Here's some pattern ideas, and here's some maybe even some interface elements. And what this allows us to do, these aren't deliverables as far as, you email it over and say, hey, tell me what you think. No, this is coupled with a conversation, right? This is here's what we're going for, here's why we're choosing these things, here's what we think these things represent. How do you feel about this? The idea is to start a conversation, to facilitate a conversation and find out what the client, what the team values and what they don't value. Right? Same thing with type. We use a tool called Typecast, which you could sort of put together all sorts of web font combinations. And that's what we would do, is we'd go through, we'd pick some representative text and just put together different type treatments and put these in front of the client, and we'd have a conversation. Here's why we think this one might be good for you, and they would give us feedback like this one's a little too chunky or this one's a little too conservative or whatever. But the idea is that we're getting a lot of insight on how, what the client values and what they don't value without having to do too much work, right? It's just that establishing direction instead of putting 3 comps in front of them and saying, oh, pick one. This is just throwing away 66% of work. And of course, they never just pick one, right? It's like, ooh, I like a little of this, a little of this. Can you put these? Yeah. Samantha Warren, who created style tiles, she calls them Franken-comps, right? Where it's the worst of all directions. So once we establish that design direction, then it's time to sort of roll up our sleeves. And so from an IAA standpoint, this is Robert Gorell, who worked with us on Entertainment Weekly, just sort of really chunking out, what those bits of content are, right? What needs to be on the page and in what general order. And again, sort of thinking mobile first, that forces the hierarchy of information. This thing is more important than this thing because it's on top of it. Right? There's no room to just push it all above the fold. So it really forces you to focus on what matters. And you basically, again, just more conversation with the clients. Like, is everything here? Are we missing things? Yes or no? And for TechCrunch, I still consider this mobile-first design, but because we had these ad requirements, we sort of had to sort of design with those in mind. So again, just sort of, it's still a stacked sort of DOM. And so during this phase, I'm not sort of sitting on my hands. I'm sort of figuratively looking over the shoulders of Jennifer, and I'm starting to stitch this stuff together in code, right? And so this is what the homepage looked like, right out of the gate. Now, again, this looks like shit, and that's fine. Right? Because right now, all I'm doing is sort of doing the plumbing, right? I'm just wiring everything together, just putting those patterns in place, naming them, and sort of prepping them to be ready. And Dan would go elevate from style tiles into what he calls element collages. What element collages are is still exploratory. They're not, this is what your website is going to be, but rather getting a little more tangible into sort of interface design and saying, here's what your pagination might look like, or here's what accordion could look like. And again, this is coupled with conversation, communication with the client, saying, what do you think? Do you think that this sort of feels good? And very clearly, this isn't a web page, right? And it is still really important to sort of help the client realize that. But it's just sort of getting a little closer to that final stage without having to do full-on comps, right? And so we would do this with different organisms, right, like a header. And we would have conversations, we would iterate through these things. And what's nice about having a conversation about a header in sort of the abstract is that people don't get sidetracked by going, like, here's the homepage, for example. What do you think of the header? They're like, I don't like that guy's face, right? I don't like that stock image face. And it's like, that's fine. What do you think of the type? It's like, nope, guy's face. I hate this direction, right? And so it's hard to sort of decouple, those conversations, which is again why we're sort of doing it in like fragments and sort of building up, getting more tangible over time. And so what that allows me to do is sort of go through and start massaging those organisms in Pattern Lab. And eventually, whenever we sort of have all those pieces in place, all those gray sort of FPO pieces, would go through and start actually designing these organisms. So this is ultimately what the final TechCrunch header looked like. And so we would end up in these sort of weird situations wherever one organism was done and the rest of the site still looked like garbage. But it's fine, and you would think that presenting this type of thing to a client would be like, you're fired type stuff, but at the same time, we're constantly communicating, right? We'd have meetings once a week and be sort of sending them stuff over. So they're seeing progress getting made every week. So it's not all that crazy to present them something like this. And they actually did a really good job at sort of working with us on this. So it's really only at this stage that we actually take the time to actually craft comps. And again, respectfully disagree. Like Photoshop is actually a great tool for some people. So Dan, it's like his weapon of choice. He is one of the most talented designers I know. And yes, he does actually know code more than most people, but he is far more efficient in Photoshop than he would ever be in HTML and CSS or Sketch or some other tool. So it's really just about using the right tool for the right job at the right time. Because by the time we actually started putting together these full comps, we had already established a lot of our system. We've already had these really, really important foundational conversations. And the big thing is that we would put this together to paint that full picture, but then would iterate in the browser, right? So we'd have feedback on this stuff. They say, oh, could you, add some sort of containing lines or sort of bump this in a little bit? And it's like, sure, yeah, we'll get this into the browser and start making those changes, right? So the idea is again, and this might be one person, but in most of the organizations I've ever been a part of and have worked with, have talked to, it is a multidisciplinary team, and it's important to just sort of go through and iterate, right? Sort of this designing and building and sort of going back and forth. And the funny thing is that a lot of Dan's Photoshop work ended up mostly being for my eyes only. Right? He would give me something, I would implement it in the browser, and then there'd be an area that just wouldn't quite work, or just things weren't looking right. And so we'd have a conversation, he would go through and end up sort of like screenshotting the browser and sort of rearranging some things, and would come back to me and say, how about this? How does this look? Say, yeah, that's great, and then we'll give that a try, and just iterate through that process. And I think of this process as a bit like stone sculpture. Right, where you start with this big slab of rock, and then you start chipping away at it, right? And you take a pass, and you start extracting a shape, and then you take another pass at it, and start really extracting that shape. And you can repeat that process until you can eventually go through and start like detailing a face, and then move on to the arms and things like that. And then and by the end of it, you end up with the final work, right? The only difference is that we have Command Z, which is kind of nice, right? So, this is our reality, right? And this is hard and necessary. I think it's just absolutely necessary. This quote from Benjamin Franklin, I think, really applies to the world we live in, right? We're working on a medium that's 25 years old. Right, so how in the world are we already set in our ways, right? It's like we're at the very beginning of this entire medium, so it's absolutely foolish to say, oh, this is how we've always done things. Oh, we can't change, right? But so for as hard and essential as it is important to point out that this is really fun, right? I played with a lot of Lego as a kid. I don't see this as being very much different, to be quite honest. Just get paid for it now. Sort of awesome, right? We could probably have jobs that are way freaking worse than this. And so, here we are. Right now, we're looking at close to 7 billion mobile subscriptions on the face of the earth, right? 2.4 billion people with access to the web. And this is the trajectory, right? More people getting phones, access to mobile, more people accessing the web, and more people accessing the web through their mobile devices. And these are two of humanity's greatest technological achievements. And where are we? Right smack in the middle, trying to make them all work together. I personally can't think of a better place to be. So, thanks, guys.